The hill of fog and fire. The fog lay thick over western Normandy on the morning of August 7th, 1944, so dense that even the nearby hedgerows dissolved into formless shadows. It was a damp, living fog, the kind that clung to uniforms and softened the world into a muffled hush. Atop a lonely rise hill 314 above the small French town of Mortain, American soldiers from the 2nd Battalion 120th Infantry Regiment slowly woke to a dawn they could not yet see. Before the sun could burn through the mist, the first sound came. A low, distant growl, engines, many of them. The men paused in their routine coffee heating in battered mess cups, boots being laced, foxholes being cleared of mud. For a few moments the rumble blended with the natural breath of the morning. But then the ground itself began to vibrate. Pebbles danced in metal cups, weak branches shuddered with each pulse, and at last they knew something was coming up the slopes. Private First Class Clarence Wisnant, thin, soft-spoken, barely 20, leaned over the edge of his foxhole and tried to peer into the fog. He saw nothing, only white dents shifting nothing. He listened again. Engines, clattering treads, the faint metallic rattle of turret armor shifting weight. That unmistakable sound. Tanks. He swallowed hard. The night before his company commander had spoken of possible German activity. Local patrols had spotted armored vehicles on the eastern roads, but nobody expected this. Mortain was supposed to be quiet, rear area, a place of rest and regathering after the bloodletting of the Normandy hedgerows. But this was not a patrol, it was an army. Wisnant whispered to the man beside him they were coming up, a lot of them. Sergeant Bill Day, older, broad-shouldered, a North Carolina tobacco farmer before the war, nodded grimly. He had fought at St. Lo. He could identify a tank by its engine note alone. This sound was not one tank nor two. It was a column of German armor. He lifted his field glasses, though they were useless in the fog. "Get the men ready," he muttered. "Get everyone awake." Around them the hill began to stir. Shapes rose from shallow foxholes, checked rifles, dragged ammunition crates into position. The Battalion S mortar crews shook sleep from their bodies and began aligning tubes toward nothing but mist. Someone muttered, "This ain't right. This ain't right at all." Down in the valley, hidden entirely in the fog, German panzer crews sat inside their steel beasts, Panzer Roman, IVs, and Panthers of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, men determined to strike a blow that could turn the war in France. They believed the fog was their ally. They believed they would smash through the American lines, reach Avranches, and sever the spearhead of the Allied breakout, known as Operation Cobra. Up on Hill 314, the Americans knew nothing of that. Not yet. Wisnant could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots now. The fog swirled in long gray streamers, pulled aside by the movement of massive armored shapes, rising unseen toward them. Then suddenly the fog split. A single Panther tank emerged like a specter breaking through a veil. Its hull glistened with Dewitt's cannon pointing directly toward the hilltop. All at once time contracted. Wisnant froze. Speech deserted him. The Panther S turret shifted. The fog glowed faintly around its muzzle brake. Sergeant Day had just enough time to shout down. The Panther fired. The hill exploded with the flash of the first round. Earth and stones erupted skyward. Men ducked dove flattened themselves into the soil as the blast echoed out over the valley. Then a second tank appeared. Then a third. Then a dozen silhouettes materialized, steel phantoms advancing in near silence until they fired again. Mortain was under attack. The battalion commander's voice crackled through the radios. "This is it, boys. Hold your ground. Hold Hill 314 at all costs." The order was simple, brutal, absolute. Hold. Wisnant gripped his M1 rifle so tightly his knuckles turned pale beneath the grime. His breathing became shallow, quick. Around him, men braced themselves behind shattered hedgerows and broken stone walls. The fog was no longer quiet. It was illuminated by artillery flashes and the thunder of German guns. For a moment Wisnant found himself thinking not of battle, not of tactics, but of home. He pictured the slow sunrise over the fields of Burke County, North Carolina, the mornings when fog settled among the crops in the same quiet way. But there were no tanks in those memories, no steel beasts clawing their way up the slopes hunting for him. He blinked sharply, forcing himself back. There was no home now, only the hill, only the battalion, only survival. The fog thinned for a brief instant, and he finally saw the scale of what advanced toward them. Dozens of tanks, hundreds of infantry, Germans moving in dark waves through the pale morning. It looked unreal, like a swelling tide of shadows. Wisnant whispered, "Dear God." Sergeant Day steadied him with a firm hand on the shoulder. "Stay low, pick your shots." Don T raced around. Their world shrank to the earthen rim of the foxhole. The German assault began in earnest. Machine gun bursts tore through the hedgerows. Mortar shells whistled overhead and burst behind the hilltop. Artillery fire in blind arcs crashed among the trees. The air filled with bark soil smoke and the unmistakable smell of cordite. Again and again tanks fired their cannon blasts, making the very air ripple. An American bazooka team scrambled behind a stone wall, loading a round as the nearest Panther advanced. They fired too soon, too low. The rocket bounced off the tank's sloped armor with a useless spark. A second shot missed altogether. The bazooka crew dove for cover as the Panther traversed its turret toward them. The hill trembled with the impact of the tank's reply. Wisnant wiped dirt from his eyes, heart hammering. He watched Sergeant Day crawl to the edge of their position and peer down with his binoculars. Day didn't he speak. He didn't he curse. He simply stared. Finally he exhaled. They trying to take the whole damn hill. Wisnant swallowed back fear. Can we stop them? Day lowered the glasses. We don't have to stop them, he said quietly. We just have to hold. The words echoed over the hill, spoken by officers, NCO radio men, runners. Hold the hill at all costs. And as the fog began at last to lift, revealing the full German onslaught below them, the men of the 2nd Battalion understood the reality. They were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off. Yet they were the only force standing between the Germans and a breakthrough that could cripple the Allied advance. The battle for Hill 314 had begun, and it would become one of the fiercest stands of the European war. The counterstroke of a broken army, the fog over Mortain, had not lifted by accident. It arrived with purpose, with timing, with a sense of grim orchestration that mirrored the plans unfolding far behind the German lines. For weeks, German commanders had watched their defenses in Normandy collapse, first under the relentless weight of Allied artillery, then beneath the armored spearheads unleashed by Operation Cobra. Town after town had fallen. Entire divisions had been gutted, scattered, or encircled. What remained of the Wehrmacht in the West now clung to France by its fingernails. Adolf Hitler had issued a single uncompromising order: counterattack. Drive them into the sea. It was a command divorced from reality, but it carried the force of absolute authority. To fulfill it, the German High Command OB West assembled what strength they still possessed. They pieced together remnants of armored formations, scraped up fuel reserves, and shifted elite SS units from one threatened sector to another. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, bloodied in the fighting around Keene and Falaise, was chosen to spearhead the blow. Its mission was simple in theory: strike west from the vicinity of Mortain, seize the crossroads town of Avranches, and cut off the American armies pouring through the breakout gap. If Avranches fell, the entire Allied advance into Brittany and southern Normandy could be severed, perhaps reversed. It was a last gamble, bold, desperate, and almost certainly doomed. But the Germans had gambled before in this war, and sometimes the impossible had bent in their favor. The attack was codenamed Operation Luttich. On the American side, the suddenness of the situation gave little warning. The U.S. First Army had believed the Germans too damaged to launch a significant counteroffensive. They were wrong. Signals intelligence at Ultra had detected hints of a German plan, but the information had not fully filtered down in time. Few in the American lines expected the blow to fall where it did. Mortain, a modest French town nestled among low rolling hills, became the axis of that blow. Its roads linked east to west, north to south. If the Germans cracked the American defenses here, they could fan out like a storm surge, and dominating Mortain from above was Hill 314. To most who passed it, Hill 314 was just another rise in the Normandy countryside, a patchwork of grass scrub, small woods, and scattered stone walls. But its height made it a natural observation post, a place where any forward observer with field glasses could command an immense view of the surrounding terrain. Whoever held it could direct artillery with devastating accuracy. The Germans knew this. The Americans knew this. And on the night of August 6, 1944, the men of the 2nd Battalion 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, were ordered to occupy Hill 314. It was routine assignment, or so they believed. The Battalion S officers understood they were stepping into a pressure point, but none imagined how severe the pressure would become. The 30th Infantry Division had earned a reputation in Normandy for stubborn, punishing combat. They had fought through the hedgerows around St. Lo, often at ranges so close that rifles were unnecessary. Men fought with grenades and bayonets over the same blood-soaked field dozens of times. Hill 314, whatever its challenges, would surely be no worse than that. But the terrain misled them. On paper, the hill was a natural fortress. In reality, its slopes were too broad, its approaches too numerous, its small farms and orchards too easy for German troops to infiltrate. Worse, the battalion was not fully entrenched. They had arrived during the night. Foxholes were shallow, fields of fire were only partially cleared, and then there was the fog. It had drifted in after midnight. By dawn, the entire hilltop was blind. Inside, German command posts officers of Das Reich recognized their opportunity. The fog shielded their movements, concealed their armor, and drowned out the hum of engines. At 0430 hours on August 7th, the first German units began pushing forward armored cars, leading tanks behind infantry packed into half-tracks or advancing on foot. The attack was massive. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart Adolf Hitler, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen, and supporting units from Wehrmacht divisions by nearly 200 tanks and assault guns backed by thousands of infantry moved toward the American lines. At the tactical level, the attack was precise. German engineers had mapped out where the Americans could see and where they could not. The plan was to sweep around Mortain, seize the town, overrun American artillery positions, and punch straight toward Avranches like a mailed fist. But Hill 314 was the obstacle they had underestimated. On top of the hill, Lieutenant Colonel William K. Harrison Jr., the battalion commander, was already awake when the rumble began. A strict, purposeful man, Harrison had survived the chaos of the Normandy battles with a reputation for calm under fire. When the first reports came in, enemy armor massing in the fog, he did not shout, did not panic, did not rush. He simply ordered every unit to stand to. Radio operators began calling artillery positions miles to the rear. Mortar crews assembled on the hill's eastern slope. Machine gun teams checked their ammunition belts. Infantrymen, still half asleep, fumbled for their rifles and helmets with numb fingers. The Battalion S world narrowed to a single command: hold your ground. And yet, even as Harrison prepared his battalion, he understood the scale of what approached. Within minutes, they heard the first of the German tanks. Within hours, the battalion would be cut off. By nightfall, they would be completely surrounded. Few knew that the hill would become a fortress. Fewer still knew that it would become a trap. Because from the moment the German attack began, Hill 314 stopped being just another assignment. It became the keystone of the entire American defense. Without the hill, the Germans could punch through the lines and tear a hole in the Allied campaign. The men defending it, hardly more than 700 strong, stood in the path of 2 panzer divisions. Somewhere on the slopes, Clarence Wissant felt the vibrations of the approaching tanks and tried to breathe slowly. The fear that knotted inside him came from something deeper than danger. This was not like the hedgerows. This was not like St. Lo. This was something larger, something with purpose and weight. The Germans were coming not just to kill them, they were coming to break them. For the first time, the scattered fog drifted enough for Wissant to glimpse the valley below, dark shapes, advancing infantry, moving in disciplined formations behind prowling tanks. He exhaled a shaky breath. This was no probing attack. It was an all-out offensive, and Hill 314, whether ready or not, would decide its fate. The quiet riflemen, the artillery shells, had not yet begun their terrible work when Private First Class Clarence Wissant felt the first shiver of doubt. It was not fear, not yet, but the unsettling realization that something vast and violent was awakening in the fog below. He had sensed danger before in Normandy, in the hedgerows, where every shadow hid a rifleman and every orchard concealed a machine gun nest. But this was different. Something heavy was coming. He could feel it in the soles of his boots trembling through the damp soil of Hill 314. Wissant was 20 years old, though he looked younger. His face was smooth and pale beneath the grime, his eyes soft, almost apologetic. He spoke rarely. When the men joked, he listened. When they cursed, he nodded. When they bragged about what they did do after the war, he remained silent, unsure if he dared imagine such a future. He was a quiet rifleman, one of those soldiers who slipped effortlessly into the background until the moment battle found him. He had grown up in Burke County, North Carolina, the son of a mill worker. Before the war, most of his days were spent in the long, low textile buildings that dominated the town's skyline, dusty places, filled with the whir of machinery. The work was monotonous, but at least it was familiar. He never thought about Europe, never imagined France, never imagined a hill outside a town called Mortain. War had a way of carrying men far from the places where they belonged. He had been a replacement when he arrived in Normandy. Someone had handed him an M1 rifle, another had pointed toward a hedgerow, and that was the moment his old life ended. He learned quickly, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. The 30th Infantry Division did not have time for slow learners. The fighting in the hedgerows was relentless, intimate, bewildering. Bullets came from 10 yards away. Grenades landed in the same foxholes men slept in. Wissant survived St. Lo by listening, by trusting the instincts of Sergeant Bill Day, the man who had become almost by accident the anchor around which his courage formed. Day was steady, sharp-eyed, patient. He never yelled at the men unless he had to. He never blustered the way some NCO did to mask their own fear. He simply did what needed to be done. Wissant admired him, though he rarely said so. Now on Hill 314, he found himself once again at Day's side, 2 figures crouched in a shallow foxhole barely large enough for both. Around them, the battalion stirred, unaware of just how many German tanks were climbing the slopes. Day glanced down the line of foxholes. He saw shadows moving, riflemen getting into position, machine gun crews adjusting their barrels, mortar teams preparing their first rounds. He nodded to himself. "We hold," he said quietly, not to Wissant so much as to the morning air. Wissant swallowed. His throat felt tight. "How many you think there are?" Day wiped a bead of moisture from his binocular lenses. "More than enough." The fog thinned slightly. Not enough to reveal the valley fully, but enough to give shape to movement. Wisnant watched the silhouettes of German infantry advancing behind tanks' grey shadows in the mist, rifles slung low, helmets bobbing as they pushed up the slope. He had been told the Germans were beaten. He had been told the enemy was retreating, that Normandy was almost won. But the men rising from the fog did not look defeated. They looked determined, disciplined, fierce. These were not scattered remnants, they were a division marching with purpose. A sudden mortar burst erupted near one of the American machine gun positions. Wisnant flinched, instinctively ducking as soil rained down. A second shell hit closer. The Germans had zeroed in on the hilltop, even though they couldn't fully see it. Their forward observers were experienced, and the fog worked both ways. Day tapped Wisnant's shoulder. Eyes up, don't get tunnel vision. They'll be using the fog to get close. Wisnant nodded, peering through the shifting white haze. He raised his rifle, letting the stock settle firmly into his shoulder. The weapon was familiar, so familiar that it almost felt like an extension of his own body. He had cleaned it the night before, checked every clip ensured every round was seated properly. A soldier's rifle was more than equipment. It was the only piece of control he had left. Below them a Panther tank loomed into partial view. Its hull slid through the fog like a leviathan, its engine low and growling. The turret rotated slowly, hunting for a target it could not yet see. The tank's tracks clattered over stones. Its commander stood half exposed in the turret cupola, scanning the hilltop through goggles. Wisnant exhaled slowly. They re close. They'll be closer soon, Day replied. The first German infantry squad appeared behind the Panther, leaning forward as they advanced, rifles ready, bayonets fixed. Wisnant's heart hammered so hard he felt the pulse against his dog tags. He was invisible in the mist, but that would not last. At any second the fog might lift just enough for the Germans to spot the thin American line along the crest. He steadied himself. He remembered something his mother had told him years ago, long before the war. When life scares you, hold still for a moment. You can think when your heart is running. He tried to hold still now. Sergeant Day lifted his binoculars for a final look, and then said, "Don't fire until they re-close, real close, make every round count." Wisnant gripped his rifle tighter. Then came the sound that defined the day, the sound that froze every American on the hill. A tank commander shouting in German, a hand thrust forward, and the first burst of machine gun fire ripping through the fog. The German attack had begun. Wisnant fired his first shot almost without thinking, the recoil sharp but familiar. A shadow staggered and fell. A second round followed, then a third. He was no longer the quiet rifleman from Burke County. He was a defender of Hill 314. Around him the battle took shape, rifles cracking, mortars thudding, machine guns roaring from hastily dug positions. Men shouted orders, warnings, curses. The fog glowed orange with muzzle flashes. Wisnant fought with a clarity he had never felt. The noise around him faded, the chaos softened. He could see only his targets, German shapes moving through smoke, tanks advancing in grim procession, infantry surging up the hill. For the first time in the war he felt something like resolve. He was not fighting for victory or glory. He was fighting because the man next to him needed him, because the battalion needed him, because if Hill 314 fell, the entire line would crumble. And the Germans were not stopping. They pressed forward, firing, shouting, advancing despite the American resistance. Shells burst above the hilltop, showering the defenders with fragments of steel and burning dust. But the Americans held their ground. Wisnant reloaded, breath sharp in his chest. The quiet rifleman was gone. A soldier stood in his place. Encircled on the heights by mid-morning, the fog had thinned just enough for the full weight of the German attack to reveal itself. What had begun as scattered silhouettes in shifting mist was now a visible, unmistakable truth. Hill 314 was surrounded, completely. From every slope, German armor and infantry pressed upward with deliberate, coordinated force. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison knew the situation was deteriorating by the minute. American units positioned on the lower slopes had already been overrun. Communications with several companies had gone silent. And the battalion's ammunition supply, never plentiful to begin with, was dwindling under the relentless pressure. At 0830 hours, Harrison gathered his officers inside a shallow depression bordered by a low stone wall. Artillery shells thudded not far away, shaking dust loose from the wall's cracks. The men crouched, close faces strained, helmets dented and muddy. A runner arrived breathless. "Sir, enemy tanks on the southwest slope." 40 yards from Baker Company's line, Harrison nodded, his expression unchanged. He looked at the small group around him. "Gentlemen, this hill is the key. If we break, the Germans reach Avranches. If they reach Avranches, the whole army is split in two. We hold or we lose everything." Captain Patterson wiped soot from his cheek. "Sir, the battalion is nearly out of mortar rounds." "Then we ration them," Harrison said quietly. "1 round per identified target. None for suppressive fire." Another officer spoke. "What about withdrawal?" Harrison looked at each man in turn. "There is no withdrawal. We hold the hill." His tone wasn't heroic. It wasn't loud. It was simply final. On the eastern crest, Clarence Wisnant and Sergeant Day had no time to ponder those decisions. Their world was narrowed to the space in front of them, the rocky lip of their foxhole, the rising slope below, the shadows of German infantry pushing relentlessly upward. A burst of machine gun fire rattled overhead, tearing leaves from the trees. Wisnant ducked instinctively. A tracer round hissed past his shoulder like a red-hot needle. Sergeant Day leaned close. "Conserve your ammo. Aim small. We don't know how long this will last." Wisnant worked his rifle's action, ejecting a spent clip with the familiar metallic ping. He grabbed a new one from his belt, slid it home, and rose just high enough to fire again. Below him, a German squad was maneuvering behind a fractured stone wall, preparing to advance. Wisnant took aim, breath steady, and squeezed the trigger. One man fell. Another darted behind cover. The squad hesitated, but only for a moment. They were coming again. Across the hilltop, similar scenes unfolded. Machine gun teams repositioned their weapons as German tanks tried to envelop the crest. Mortar crews fired their remaining rounds sparingly, each shot chosen with precision. Medics crawled from foxhole to foxhole, dragging the wounded out of open fire. German artillery found its range shortly after 0900. Shells screamed overhead and burst with brutal force across the hilltop. Trees split apart. Shrapnel tore into earth and flesh. The air filled with a choking haze of smoke and dust. Wisnant felt the concussive blast of a shell that struck 10 yards from his hole. He was thrown backward, ears ringing, rifle slipping from his hands. For a moment all sound vanished. The world became a silent whirl of white dust. Sergeant Day grabbed his jacket, shaking him. "Stay with me, Clarence. Find your rifle." Wisnant blinked hard and reached for the weapon, fingers trembling. He forced himself upright, heart pounding in his throat. The German assault had moved closer, so close he could hear shouted commands in sharp-clipped German. Day tapped his helmet. "Clarence, look." Wisnant followed his gaze. A Panther tank was emerging from the tree line barely 60 yards away, its hull angled toward the foxholes at the hill's crown. The tank's commander stood exposed, shouting to infantry clustered beside the vehicle. Wisnant's breath caught. "They rewrite on top of us." Day's jaw tightened. "We can kill that tank, not with rifles, but we can kill the men around it." They opened fire again, deliberate, measured shots. German infantry fell. Others took their place. The Panther fired its main gun, the blast tearing a chunk of earth from the hillside and sending American soldiers scrambling. To the north, a machine gun team from Company E was hit by shell fragments. Their gun fell silent. A German squad surged forward toward the gap. Harrison's voice crackled through the battalion radio net. "All units, no surrender, fight where you stand." The hill now belonged to no one. It was contested ground, every foxhole, every tree line, every shattered wall, a micro-battle in a larger storm. At 1100 hours, German troops broke momentarily through the American perimeter on the western ridge. For 10 chaotic minutes fighting was hand-to-hand, rifle butts cracked against helmets, knives flashed, grenades rolled down foxholes. Wisnant could hear the screams from across the hill, but he could not leave his position. The enemy was attacking everywhere at once. Ammo was nearly gone. A runner arrived tumbling into their foxhole. "Sergeant Day, we almost dry. Command says pick targets only at close range. We might have to rely on artillery now." Day frowned. "Artillery, they can see us. They see us through you," the runner said breathlessly. "Forward observers are using this hill for correction. If we hold, we keep the guns firing. If we lose the hill, artillery goes blind." Day understood immediately. Without Hill 314, the American guns miles to the rear would be firing blind. The Germans would tear a hole through the division. This hill wasn't just ground. It was the eyes of the entire defense. Wisnant reloaded again, though he had only a few clips left. "Sergeant," he whispered, "if they come again, I don't know if I have enough rounds." Day placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Clarence, just keep firing until you can tee. Then we hold with whatever we've got." Another wave of German infantry surged up the slope. Wisnant raised his rifle, every muscle tense. The Germans were closer than ever now, so close he could see the sweat on their faces, the mud smeared across their tunics. So close he could hear their breath, ragged and fierce. He fired and fired again, each shot deliberate, each one necessary. The Germans kept coming. The battle reached its highest pitch. At noon, the hill shook under the weight of fighting men, burning armor, collapsing trees. Smoke blanketed the ridge. Shells burst so close that they sucked the air from men's lungs. But the Americans did not break. Wisnant fought until his last clip ran dry. Then he reached into the dirt for dropped magazines, scavenging whatever he could find. At 1300 hours, German armor attempted a final thrust toward the summit. For a moment, a single terrible moment, it seemed the hill might fall, and then the first American artillery salvo landed. It came down like thunder. Shell after shell called in by the few surviving observers hammered the German formations climbing the slope. Panthers reversed violently, infantry dove for cover, entire squads were thrown backward by the concussive force. Wisnant felt the blasts shake his chest. For the first time that day he saw German troops retreating. "We re-holding," someone shouted. "We re-holding the hill." Sergeant Day allowed himself a thin, exhausted smile. "Not done yet," he murmured, "but we still here." Wisnant sagged back into the foxhole chest, heaving rifle trembling in his hands. They had survived the first day, they had held, but at a terrible cost one the next chapter would reveal in full. The hill that refused to fall night settled over Hill 314, not gently, but like a slow collapse of the sky. The smoke still hung low in the air, drifting in long grey ribbons across the battered ridge. Fires smoldered in the wreckage of shattered trees. The stumps glowed red as embers clung stubbornly to life. The smell burning wood, hot metal blood, clung to every American soldier who remained alive. By the final hours of August 7th, the battalion had been reduced to small islands of men scattered around the hilltop, clusters of foxholes, disconnected positions, fragments of companies that no longer resembled the units they were at dawn. Radio lines were frayed or gone. Medics crawled through the darkness, whispering names, checking for breath. Many of the wounded whispered for water. Some whispered for home, but the German attack had stalled. The 2nd SS Panzer Division had hurled itself at the hill again and again throughout the day. Each assault had come closer, pushed deeper, threatened to split the American line apart entirely. Yet at every critical moment something fate artillery's stubborn resistance had stopped the advance just short of the crest. When darkness finally covered the battlefield, the Germans paused to regroup. Their officers believed the hill would fall with renewed assault in the morning. They had broken American resistance everywhere else. They had slipped through the outer defenses, seized. Mortain reached the outskirts of several auxiliary towns. But the hill remained, and as long as the hill remained, American artillery had eyes. Inside a ruined orchard near the summit, Clarence Wissant sat with his back against a tree trunk that no longer had branches. His rifle lay across his lap. His hands trembled from exhaustion. Beside him, Sergeant Day rested with his helmet pushed back, eyes closed, but still alert enough to react if a twig snapped. Wissant whispered, "Sergeant, how many rounds you got left?" Day shook his head. "Not enough." A long silence followed. The night hummed with the distant growl of German engines repositioning down the slope. Occasionally a flare arced into the sky, bathing the hilltop in a cold, ghostly light. The men froze when the light passed overhead. They had learned that movement in the open drew machine gun fire from the darkness below. Wissant stared at the faint glow of Mortain's burning buildings in the valley. "They coming again tomorrow." "Yes," Day said quietly. "Can we hold?" Day took a breath. "We'll hold as long as we can, maybe longer." It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't false hope. It was simply the truth spoken by a man who had fought too long to rely on optimism. Their small group, 12 men now, where once there had been 30, huddled close against the chill of night. They had little food left, almost no water. Ammunition was rationed by the handful. Some soldiers had picked up German rifles from the dead because their own weapons had run dry. And in the midst of this ruin, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison still moved from position to position, speaking to the men with a quiet steadiness that held the line together. "We cut off," he told them, "but division knows our situation. They fighting to reach us. We hold until they break through." When Harrison left, several men exchanged weary looks. "Sir, they ain't getting through here anytime soon," someone murmured, but no one said it loud enough for the lieutenant colonel to hear. His belief was a candle in a dark room. None wanted to extinguish it. August 8th came with no sunrise, only smoke and low clouds. By mid-morning, the Germans resumed their attack, probing first, then advancing with more force. But something had shifted. They had suffered heavy losses the previous day, and more importantly, American artillery, guided by the surviving observers on Hill 314, had blanketed the surrounding roads throughout the night. Supply columns were hit. Infantry staging areas were torn apart. Several German tanks were knocked out by long-range fire before they could move into position. Still, the fighting on the slopes intensified. Wissant fired until his bolt would barely cycle. Day scrounged enemy ammunition. Men fought with bayonets, grenades, and whatever they could find. When German troops broke through a thin section of the line near the western ridge, the Americans counterattacked not with numbers but with desperation. It worked. The Germans fell back, once more shaken by the ferocity of an enemy they assumed to be already broken. At noon, another American artillery barrage thundered down upon the road east of Mortain, destroying a column of armored vehicles preparing to ascend toward the hill. At 1,400 hours, fighter-bombers from the 9th Air Force broke through the cloud cover and dove upon German positions in the valley, strafing and bombing relentlessly. By late afternoon, the German offensive was unraveling. Das Reich had thrown its weight at the hill for nearly 48 hours. Now, with fuel dwindling, tanks, damaged infantry depleted, and American reinforcements pressing in from multiple directions, their commanders began to grasp a terrible truth. Hill 314 would not fall. The attack on Mortain, Operation Luttich, had failed. On the evening of August 10th, the first American relief elements reached the battered defenders of Hill 314. Armored vehicles rolled carefully up the slope, weaving through shell holes and burned-out trees. Medics hurried forward, carrying water bandages, morphine. Soldiers of the 117th Infantry Regiment approached the hilltop with a mix of awe and horror. The men of the 2nd Battalion did not cheer. They did not shout. They did not rise triumphantly from their foxholes. Most simply sat where they were staring at the relief forces with hollow eyes. Some wept quietly. Some fell asleep without a word. Clarence Whisnant lowered his rifle, the weapon he had carried through 2 days of combat that felt like 2 lifetimes. The barrel was blackened with smoke. His hands were raw. He could no longer feel his fingers. Sergeant Day looked out over the valley now littered with burned German tanks and the still forms of men who had never reached the crest. "We held Clarence," he said softly. Whisnant nodded, but he could not speak. The weight of it, what they had endured, what they had prevented, pressed on him more heavily than fear ever had. In the days that followed, the scale of the German defeat became clear. The failed counterattack at Mortain left their armored divisions weakened and exposed. It opened the way to the Falaise pocket, where Germany's last chance to halt the Allied advance in Normandy collapsed entirely. The stand on Hill 314 had been a fulcrum, one point upon which the wider campaign balanced. And yet to the men who fought there it did not feel like heroism, it felt like survival. Historians would later praise the stand as one of the most important defensive actions of the European war. They would cite the battalion's courage, its refusal to break its critical role in blinding and blunting the German offensive. They would call Hill 314 a symbol of American resolve. But for Whisnant and the men beside him, the memory was simpler. They were ordinary soldiers who had been given an impossible order, and they had obeyed it, not for glory, not for recognition, but because the man next to them would not run, and neither would they. In the end, Hill 314 stood not because of strategy or artillery or even luck, but because a few hundred tired, hungry riflemen refused to let it fall, and in their refusal the tide of a campaign, and perhaps even the course of a war, shifted forever.